Now it's time for a panel of experts. Michael Neal is a senior research associate in the Housing Finance Policy Center at the Urban Institute, one of my favorite institutions in town. They are like data central on stuff. He's had previous roles at Fannie Mae and the National Association of Home Builders. Jeff Tucker is a senior economist at Zillow. We all know Zillow, where he studies the causes and consequences of changing supply in the housing market. And Chi-Chi Wu is a staff attorney at the National Consumer Law Center, where she focuses on consumer credit issues. She's the author of the legal manual, Fair Credit Reporting, and is a contributing author to Consumer Credit Regulation and Truth in Lending. Chi-Chi, let me start with you. Again, we're trying to get today, look at this question of the reality of credit invisible people. People have been excluded. And let me just tell you, there's another dimension that's uncomfortable, one of those uncomfortable conversations. People that aren't inside the sandbox of financial inclusion, in my opinion, they're preyed upon. Everything is more expensive. Everything is more complicated. There's, a set of social ills that comes with that. So I'm interested in what you think we need to do to particularly address those communities that have been excluded from the financial scene.
Well, first of all, the first thing I want to mention is my mantra, or Consumers Advocates' mantra, about alternative data, which is the devil is in the details. It is really important when you're talking about alternative data and trying to help credit invisibles that you do it right, that you do it in a way so that they are not preyed upon.
Right.
There's some data that's shown a lot of promise. For example, the analysis of cash flow in people's bank accounts, credits and debits and balances has shown some promise. Usually, pre-pandemic, we've said rent payments have shown promise. But as we all know, people are struggling right now to pay rent. So maybe not so much right now. Flip side, there's some kinds of alternative data that are really risky for consumers. One of those is alternative data about high cost loans, payday loans, auto title loans, high cost installment loans. And, talk about predatory, talk about things that cost too much. And the irony is, when there are proponents saying, well, we should use high cost lending to help credit invisibles, most of those folks aren't credit invisible. They're actually folks, unfortunately, with poor credit scores, low credit scores. And so you always have to remember that it's not just credit invisibility that you worry about. It's the folks who are struggling and who have low scores where things like credit and insurance cost more. And so you have to look at it holistically that way.
I appreciate your perspective, Michael, I happen to know a ton of your colleagues over at Urban Institute. I'm a big client and consumer of Urban Institute data. One of the things that motivated me about today's program is, if I'm reading the data right, there are about 25 million Americans who otherwise would be qualified who have no credit bureau file, 28 million who have a credit bureau file but not sufficient for scoring. So 53 million people, it's a big chunk of folks who are outside. And then that's before you get it, I think, some of the other dimensions that Chi-Chi just laid out. So I guess my question to you is, you look at this question, right, of economic activity, and one of the reasons why I was very interested today is to the degree that you can get credit where credit should be done, that you get the biases removed, that you get greater pictures that create a different set of tracks, not to do things inappropriately, but basically there is an inappropriateness in not opening up that aperture. How do you see it with your colleagues at Urban Institute?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. Look, and let me start off by saying that, I think it's important to distinguish between the cyclical conditions under which credit scores perform and the structural ones.
Right.
That is, under cyclical conditions, I think exactly to what Chi-Chi said, that in times of recession, there are going to be a portion of people that are going to be that are going to operate worse off. They're going to lose their jobs. We know the unemployment rate is going to rise. We know that some people are going to lose their jobs by definition, and they're not going to have the income to make their payments and to meet their credit obligations. And that's going to have an impact ultimately on their credit score. But at the same time, I think what we really want to get at here is the underlying structural issue. And the structural issue, I think, is most shown, particularly when we look at a lot of the issues across race. One of the things when we think about expanding credit access that we saw, particularly after the Great Recession, was that credit availability, particularly in order to buy a home, actually remained quite tight, in large part because credit scores remained elevated relative to where they were prior to the Great Recession. The longer that continued, the less of I think the less intuitive it was that there was a cyclical component to that was driving that, and that it was more being driven by a lot of the structural issues that even predated the Great Recession.
I see.
I say all that to say, the reason I say all that is because I think there are two parts that your question brings up. The first one is, to what degree do we need to expand access to credit? But also, to what degree is it the way that we measure credit, someone's credit ability, their ability to repay credit? To what degree do we need to somehow alter that? And the reason I think that both of those are important is because our data shows that we wrote a report in 2018 showing that roughly about a third of African Americans did not have a credit score. That matters because we know that house prices were rising at the same time, increasing and expanding housing equity. So these were a number of people who were not able to access credit, who may not have been able to get to access home ownership. There might have been other reasons at play that I want to touch on maybe a little bit later, hopefully, but they were not able to access home ownership, and thereby may have contributed to the widening of the wealth gap.
Well, that's why we got Jeff Tucker here of Zillow. Thank you for that, Michael. Jeff, you're in the housing world, but let me just ask you, a question. I don't know the answer to this. I mean, Zillow really operates by algorithms, and you're not a credit score, but you basically value lots of participants in the economy around the housing and rental market. It's very impressive at one level, but those algorithms and what goes into those algorithms matter. And so let me just ask you the question: how should those algorithms be shifted, do you think, to create a fairer, set of expanded credit, if that's what's deserved? How would you shift things? How would you shift your own algorithms?
Yeah, I love Chi-Chi's phrasing that the devil is in the details. When you have a giant black box algorithm, we use machine learning and artificial intelligence to train an algorithm like the Zestimate. That's sort of our claim to fame, right, is estimating the value of every home in the country. We are well aware of the risks that an algorithm like that can essentially take in data from a biased system and then recreate it and help potentially, if you're not careful, further entrench that. And I think when it comes to credit scoring, if we're starting to take information, especially if we're thinking about younger folks, people in their 20s, we're trying to get them into the credit reporting system sooner rather than later, what we may end up doing is actually getting a clear picture of how wealthy their parents are, really. If you have mom and dad able to chip in at the last minute to help you pay this bill or that bill, that's actually going to not really reflect your credit worthiness, but it's just sort of recreating the credit worthiness of your parents, which could sort of flow into some of that early life cycle data. And, I really appreciated Michael's point about the way that this housing boom, and we just saw a tremendous home price appreciation boom in 2020, has been a much less inclusive housing boom than in the 1990s or early 2000s. This was a boom predicated on actually excluding a lot of people from homeownership. We saw prices rising as homeownership rates fell or remained really low, especially for Black and Hispanic borrowers. So that's the risk there, is that you can actually, similar to credit reporting, you can kind of entrench these differences in outcomes further ahead in time. We looked back at the redlining maps. We took digitized redlining maps from the 1930s, overlaid them on the Zestimate, just looked at average Zestimate in the declining versus the best areas. There's a gap of about $300,000, or it's more than double the price still 80, 90 years later in those green lined areas, basically, compared to red lined areas. And that just reflects the way that these kind of generational inequities can get carried forward into the next generation.
Thank you for that. I'm fascinated by the Zillow. We'll have to have you back to a show on Zillow algorithms and what goes in. I've been wrestling with them. But Chi-Chi, let me come back to the devil's in the details. If you were to be in charge of expanding the inflow of data and what's read, some of the ideas right now that are being discussed today are things like rent, utility, cell phone payments. But how would you expand it? What would be the other dimensions that you would include, in what you would consider a fairer and better credit scoring picture?
So thank you for that question. And I think what I'm going to do is talk about and push back a little bit from one of your previous speakers. One of the ideas that I think is really exciting out there is the idea of a public credit registry. It's kind of bizarre that credit reporting is a private function, if you think about it. Here are these three companies, this controls all this information about us that determines our access to credit and employment, rental, housing, and insurance too, because that's what credit reports and credit scores are used for. And it's in the hands of these three private companies that don't compete with each other, and their highest duty is to make money for shareholders, not the public good, not the American economy. So this group, Demos, and our organization have supported the idea of having a public credit registry, or public option at least, that would have as its mission protecting, helping consumers, the economy, the credit economy. And so that is one idea to expand the box. In terms of, the kinds of data, we've said cash flow is promising, rental data has been promising, although right now we have a lot of struggling renters.
Right.
Gas and electric utilities we're very concerned about, and that is because those are sort of special payment obligations. They are natural monopolies. There's a lot of consumer protections that get undermined. And the way you do it is important too. If you take a lot of new data and you dump it into the credit bureau files, what you're going to do is you're going to end up hurting people who already have a credit file. You could possibly hurt people already with a credit file and with a credit score if they're having trouble paying their utilities, for example. What you want to do is use that data as an alternative or a second chance or a waterfall score. And in fact, again, the congressman mentioned an oligopoly. Why would you take this alternative data and give it to the credit bureaus, which are the very entities that compose that oligopoly? If you want competition, you want new sources of information and new companies that manage manage that data, right? You don't want to give it to the same old companies that are the problem to begin with. And so that's part of the devil in detail, not only what kind of information, but how you use it.
Michael, what kind of apertures would you open up? What do you think would be useful? And again, how do you feel about opening up on rent? So, and let me just add one other dimension, because again, Susie Orman raised it, that is there a way to begin looking? A lot of people live not on credit cards, but on debit cards. But debit cards is also financial behavior, financial footprint. You can measure, I suppose, I hate to use these words, but financial responsibility. I agree with Chi-Chi that the COVID era is a weird, anomalous era, should be accounted for in that. But what areas would you open up that you think would create a sounder and more inclusive credit space?
No, again, excellent question. And, let me start off by saying that I think, part of what I think we believe is that there is still room to expand credit access without necessarily expanding the risk that's associated with credit lending. So from that standpoint, I do think that from a structural perspective, there are certainly payments that are made consistently over time as part of your living that can somehow be included. That to a degree right now are only included if you make if an adverse event occurs. So, for example, if you're paying your mobile payment, you forget to make your payment, an inquiry comes. That inquiry will find its way onto your credit report. but it won't find its way on your credit report as you're making your mobile payment each and every month. And so somehow the degree to which those kinds of payments can be included in the way that in the credit box algorithm or assessment, I think can go some way toward expanding credit access. But I think one of the key concerns here is certainly, and I think this was mentioned a little bit earlier, are certainly issues of privacy. And how are we able to find that balance between privacy and some of the alternative data that might exist outside of the traditional scope?
Well, excellent. Jeff, one of the things that has come up is the 2008-2009 financial crisis, that at that time, when you look at, the financial markets, credit default swaps, subprime mortgages, and, that whole arena, which I will call, vast negligence in governance and to a certain degree, in my book, this is Steve Clemons saying this, a bit of corruption. But people were able to jump in and get more credit at a time than perhaps they could handle. So it's the other side of the equation, which is I'm just sort of interested in how you get the equilibrium right between getting more people in the door so that they have more credit and opportunities and they're not excluded on any appropriate bias or inappropriate bias. But you can also go the other way and begin creating hardships. And I still know people whose mortgages are underwater or who are still financially suffering from that economic crisis 12 years ago. So I'm just interested in if you and your economist colleagues at Zillow have talked about that dimension.
I mean, you sort of hit the nail on the head. It's a balance that you need to strike between availability of credit and the overextension of credit to people who are not in a position to pay it back. And we certainly saw excesses in lending in particularly 2004, 2005, even 2006. Those sort of chickens came home to roost in the crisis that really came to a head in fall 2008. We got the great the global financial crisis and the Great Recession. But there's a wide array of possibilities for credit access, particularly in the mortgage market, between what we saw in 2004, 2005, and what we've seen for the last several years, which was the last several years have seen very strict underwriting standards. We've seen the sort of apparently kind of minimum credit score just keep climbing higher. So the credit score of borrowers in recent years is impressive, astronomically high. And what that suggests is that there's actually a pretty large segment of the population that's still being excluded from the possibility of home ownership. Another dimension there really has to do with whether lenders are actually willing to extend mortgages on small purchases or refinance small loans. So there's a bit of this gap where for a lot of lenders, it's not even really worth it to get into the market with, $60,000, $70,000 mortgages in very underpriced or just low cost parts of cities, which actually makes it really hard for people who are often paying much more in rent than they would on a mortgage to get into home ownership and take on some of that chance to build equity. So I think there's a lot of space between what we did in 2005, which we absolutely should not get back to doing, and what we could be, how we could still expand credit today. I mean, just continuing to do a good job verifying income, the security of your job, alternative assets to fall back on. If we just do that, we're miles ahead of what a lot of lenders were doing in 2005. So if we start there and then think about just sort of inching this credit box outward a bit, we can make a lot of progress on opening opportunities.
I love this discussion because, it's one where it's, we're as the congressman said, we're very much in the weeds. At the same time, I hear we can get better algorithm, we can improve, we can get other communities included, and the devil's in the details. I mean, all of this sounds very constructive. We do have a question from our audience. Amina?
Hi, my name is Amina Zia. I am the founder of Blue Ridge Impact Consulting. We are a social impact firm specializing in facilitating dialogue around impactful and sustainable outcomes with community stakeholders. We would like the conversation to reflect on what role, if any, can local and state leadership, political leadership, play in ensuring that there is a stakeholdership approach to developing a sustainable response and recovery effort to ensure that we have financial inclusion. Thank you.
Big question. Financial inclusion, stakeholders, how do we get it right? Chi-Chi?
Thank you for that very thoughtful, very good question. I'm a lawyer, so, like hammer see nails, I think about laws. And I think about the way that credit reporting, credit scoring has been used for exclusion and how local and state governments can address that. So one very important issue, for example, is that a lot of folks don't realize credit reports are used for employment. About half of employers use credit reports. I mean, that's just bizarre, especially in this COVID era. If you think about some poor consumer who lost their job because by luck of the draw, they happened to work in a restaurant versus Costco, they couldn't pay their bills and their credit report is damaged. That report could exclude them from another job. And so state and local governments can address that issue and restrict the use of credit reporting. They can provide protections to consumers. Now, it's tricky because the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which is the federal law that governs credit reporting, does override state law in some, but not all instances. Happy to talk to anybody about the very gory, weedy details of that. But yeah, state and local governments can have a role in protecting their consumers from the abuses and problems with credit reporting. I mean, just one bizarre example, there is a system in New York that is using Experian to verify identities for signing up for the vaccine, which means that people who are credit invisible can't sign up to get the vaccine using that system. I mean, it's insane. So.
I invite you to write an op-ed for The Hill on that, because that's something I had not heard before. But listen, unfortunately, we've run out of time. But I want to say, you call it laws. Michael calls it data. Jeff calls it algorithms. I mean, this is the scaffolding of a really important discussion. I'm very, very happy to have had it with all of you. Thank you so much for joining us. Michael Neal, Senior Research Associate at the Urban Institute, Chi-Chi Wu, Staff Attorney at the National Consumer Law Center, and Jeff Tucker, Senior Economist at Zillow. This was terrific. I hope you'll come back, as I'm not done with this conversation, and all of you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.